This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential.
Hello, this is Eric Rosted coming to you right outside of Nashville, Tennessee. Today I'm going to cover Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. This is book 11 from my 2019 reading list of 52 total books. This episode will consist of 3 segments. The first will be a brief introduction to the book, the author, and my initial reaction. The second segment will be 3 themes that I noticed throughout the book. And then the final segment is the one thing, my one key takeaway, the one thing I always hope to remember from this book. So on to segment 1. The author, Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. He lived from 1547 to 1616 in Spain. This coincided with the Spanish Renaissance as well as the Spanish Inquisition. This book is broken up into 2 parts. The first was released in 1605, and then the second part was released in 1615, just a year before he passed away. And this book is considered the first modern novel. As for who suggested the book, I suggested it to myself. And I usually talk about where I heard about the book originally and who suggested it. But in this case, it's one that I've always wanted to read, and I finally got around to doing it. And I try to do one big major epic classic a year. So last year I did War and Peace, and then this year Don Quixote. So this is the longest book on my list for this year, but it is one that I had wanted to read for quite a while. I read the unabridged version, so it was 1,170 pages, and I read it from March 2nd through March 25th of this year. So I just finished it 3 days ago. It took me 23 total days, and in those 23 days, I spent 35 hours and 54 minutes reading the book. And that's accurate because I use a tracker now where I track the amount of time I'm reading. And one of the main reasons I did that is to see how long some of these classics would take. So it was near a 40-hour work week, 35 hours and 54 minutes. As for my initial reaction to the book, I was expecting a serious classic novel. I had in my mind that this was going to be a book about knights, chivalry, but that's about the extent. And I thought it would be kind of a serious book along the lines of maybe a War and Peace or Les Miserables. And it was not. It was hilarious. It was like watching Monty Python. I laughed out loud quite a few times, and that never happens when I'm reading. But it just kept happening over and over in this book. But the fact that it was funny and like a Monty Python skit does not mean it was a flippant novel. There were many points in the book of just extreme profundity, and I'll get into some of those later on in this episode. But it was a neat contrast of humorous yet profound. And I want to highlight one quote from the book in light of that. And this is in a section where a priest is reviewing the books in Don Quixote's library. And the books, as we'll find out, are a problem because they've put all these ideas into Don Quixote's head. And so when a priest is looking at the books in order to determine which ones need to be burned, here's a comment that the priest makes. For when he has witnessed a comedy that is well and artfully constructed, the spectator will come out laughing at its humor, enlightened by the truths it contained, marveling at the various incidents, rendered wiser by the arguments, made more wary by the snares he has seen depicted, and more prudent by the examples afforded him. It's kind of just another way of saying that humor can kind of open doors that other books may not be able to. So if you're going in expecting a serious novel, the fact that this one is funny kind of just opens you up to some of the the profound things that are pieced throughout the book. I guess the best way I can describe it, and I was talking to my wife about this book, and we were describing it in this way. She loves Hallmark movies, and if you've ever watched a Hallmark movie, well, if you've watched two of them, they are pretty much the exact same storyline. And little spoiler alert here, but they're all the same storyline. All Hallmark movies, they follow the pretty much the same exact storyline. And so Don Quixote in this light would be like Hallmark creating a spoof of a Hallmark movie, where everything that you expect to happen maybe doesn't happen, or just has a twist to it, whereas none of the Hallmark movies really do. So Don Quixote is a spoof of the chivalry books of the time, the books about knights. And apparently there were a ton of them, and they all kind of followed a similar format. But here comes Don Quixote, and it is not like that format at all. So, and just a brief or a quick notice here that there will be spoilers in this episode. So I'll be talking about things that happen towards the end of the novel. So if you are planning to read this, you may want to just press pause and then revisit the episode after you've read it. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, welcome and thanks for checking it out. I started the Books of Titans project because I needed help picking out the best books. I found out what some of the world's top performers were reading, and I started reading those books to the tune of 52 per year, or roughly one a week. I set my reading list a year in advance, and then I share it online. That creates accountability and a connection with others who are reading the same books. I want you to experience the benefits of having a yearly reading list. To that end, the Books of Titans website is stock full of resources to help you find the best books. I've also opened up the website to where you can begin sharing your reading list. This will allow you to share it with others, write reviews, and rate each book. I have 3 different plans, with the first one starting at just $9 per month. Your books will be placed in a visually stunning format that you can share on social media. Just go to booksoftitans.com/mybooks for more details. Each week, I also like to highlight a tool that can be useful for you in your reading. And this week, I want to highlight BookBub. If you're not familiar with BookBub, you go to their website, and right at the top is a newsletter sign up. And if you sign up for their newsletter, each morning you'll get an email with 6 to 10 books that are on sale that day for iBooks and Amazon Kindle. So these books will be anywhere between 99 cents and $2.99. And they're not like books you've never heard of. They're oftentimes they're books that you want to be reading, and BookBub will let you know when they're on sale on those e-readers. So if you like reading on the Kindle or your iPad, be sure to sign up for that. It's a free newsletter, and I'm not getting paid for this. I just like sharing tools that I've found that I enjoy. So back to the book. I want to highlight a few more details about the book before I get into 3 themes that I noticed throughout the novel. So Don Quixote, when we meet him, he is a 50-year-old man. He's gaunt, he's very skinny and tall, and he decides that it is fitting and necessary that he should become a hero. And the way he goes about becoming a hero is by becoming a knight. So Don Quixote has read books his entire life about knights and their adventures, and he thinks they're real. He does not think that they're just stories, but he thinks that they are truth. Now, everyone else that's at this time knows that these stories are made up, that they're fiction. But Don Quixote doesn't know that. And so that adds to a lot of the humor in this book. The closest people to him are appalled because they think he's gone mad. They think he's read so many books that his mind is just turned to mush, and that's the reason he wants to go out on these adventures. So those closest to him kind of do an intervention of sorts and try to get rid of all the books about knights that are in Don Quixote's possession. But that doesn't work. By burning these books, it doesn't remove Don Quixote's passion to go out and seek adventure. And the way he does this is as a knight errant. And I had not heard that term before reading this book, but errant means someone who is wandering in search of an adventure. So many times in this book, he would ask his horse to lead them. So they don't really have any particular thing in mind or destination in mind, but they just kind of go, and whatever they come across, that's their adventure. Don Quixote also knows that all knight errants in the stories he's read have a squire. And so he finds someone from his local community. He finds a neighbor named Sancho, and Sancho becomes his squire, and it's basically his traveling buddy. So Sancho leaves his wife and kids for the promise that as they go on these adventures, and what often happens in the books that Don Quixote has read is that the squire will one day get an island just for being around this knight who's saving people all around the world. So that's the reason Sancho joins him as his squire. What knight errants must also have is a lady to whom they sacrifice everything. And so Don Quixote chooses a lady, and he names her Dulcinea del Toboso. But it's like a lady from a neighboring area who's just a common girl, but he considers her to be this highborn lady and princess. And so there's another kind of just funny thing throughout the book that this lady who's just a common lady, he's singing praises to her. He's doing these incredible feats all for this lady. And the worst, I guess, most troubling thing in all of this is that he never even meets her. So the whole book he's referencing her, saying how he's doing all these things for her, and he's never met her. He never does meet her, and she's just a common girl. But being a knight errant, everything has to have adventure. There's like this ideal of romance that everything must have. And so when Don Quixote comes up to windmills, they're not windmills. They're giants, and he has to fight them. If he comes across prisoners, they're people who have been taken advantage of, and he must free them, even though they're the king's prisoners, and they're very bad people. And so these are just a few of the things the adventures that we see Don Quixote have, and he sets out, I guess, with a good heart, I guess, in trying to mimic what he sees in these books. But everything goes wrong, and all the good that he tries to do, it just ends up hurting the people that he's actually trying to do good for. So in the book itself, we see Don Quixote go through a pretty tremendous transformation. At first, every inn that he goes to, it could be just the nastiest inn, but he thinks it's a castle. And again, there's this concept of the ideal of the romantic. It can't just be an inn. It's got to be a castle. But slowly he loses that, and he begins to call them inns. That's just one example, but he kind of loses the romance of it all through as we see him throughout the book. So now I want to get into some of the themes that I noticed in the book. And the first one of that, the first main theme is that of contrasts. Most everyone that Don Quixote encounters considers him a madman, and yet he waxes poetically about a variety of topics. And so that's where you get a lot of these just profound statements from the book. They're actually from the character of Don Quixote, but everyone considers him a madman. So it's kind of hard to take serious what he's saying, but what he's saying is so good. I mean, he talks about a variety of topics like bravery, just war, fiction truth, soldiers versus scholars, love versus lusts, profession of arms versus profession of letters, freedom versus obligation. And these are just wonderful sections of the book. But they're coming from a madman. So there's just that contrast. There's this absurdity of him being a madman, of trying to be a knight errant when everyone knows that those were all untrue stories. but also profundity along with that absurdity. What's also funny is the contrast between Don Quixote and his squire, Sancho. So Don Quixote has this ideal, the romantic ideal of everything, but Sancho is the realist. He sees everything for what it is. So when Don Quixote sees those windmills and calls them giants, Sancho's saying, hey, wait up. Those are windmills. They're not giants. You don't have to actually attack those windmills. They're inanimate objects. So there's no reason to attack them. There's this contrast throughout the book of between those two characters. And since they're together almost the entire book, it makes for really funny. But we also kind of see their roles begin to change to where Don Quixote loses his ideal, his romantic idealism, and Sancho loses his realism, and they both kind of turn into the other. So it's kind of a neat thing to see throughout the book, but that's definitely the first theme is that of just tremendous contrasts in the book. Second theme is what I call belief system. And it goes back to Don Quixote, and he has this belief that knight errants and books about knight errants, that they're all true. And so it made me think of this question: what if people believe what they read and then they live out what they read in life? I mean that's exactly what happens in this book. So what if people do that? And what's important to realize with this book is that Don Quixote is writing this and the Inquisition is still going on. The Inquisition started in 1478, but it went through, the official end date was in the 1800s. And so he's like right in the center of this. I don't think he was in the worst part of it. I think that happened earlier, but the Inquisition it's still going on. And here's what the Inquisition did. It exercised absolute control over what could and could not be published. And so this book had to be released to the Inquisition first to make sure that it was okay. And then if it was okay and there was nothing unorthodox or critical of the church or government, then it would be released. So writers had to be very careful on how they wrote. And so for Cervantes, this kind of irony throughout the book was actually a way for him to get some points across, and maybe kind of through the Inquisition or through the editors. But he kind of hits on what the Inquisition is doing. And so in that first part where we see Don Quixote's friends burning his books and trying to get rid of these bad ideas, these ideas that have influenced Don Quixote so that he's going out and seeking these adventures and getting himself into trouble and hurting people and all sorts of stuff. Well, if he got those ideas from books, can we just burn the books? Well, what did they do in the Inquisition? They burned people at the stake, the people they didn't want their ideas to go forward. So it just kind of brings back that, what if people believe what they've read and then they live that out in life? And there's a really interesting quote along these lines in the book, and it said, "Chivalry is a religion in itself, and there are sainted knights in glory." And that's Don Quixote talking. And so when he talks, you know that you kind of take it with a grain of salt, because it could be one of his profound statements, or it could be kind of what he's read in his books, which goes back to his belief system. But you come, like, as you're reading about Don Quixote, you really come to like him. You see that he's a madman. You see that he's causing harm, but he's genuine. He believes what he's doing. He believes what he's living out, even though it's hurting a lot of people. And so just that idea of a belief system, Don Quixote always knows what to do in every situation because he lives according to the laws of chivalry. He lives according to the code of the knight errant. And that just makes things easy for him in a way of, he doesn't have to think about anything. He knows what he's supposed to do if he comes across this situation. And so belief system. That's the second theme that we see throughout the book, and really when you consider it from the position of the Inquisition, which Cervantes was living through at this time, writing this book, it really makes it even deeper there. The final theme I want to highlight is that of story versus happening truth. And I highlighted this theme in War and Peace on my episode that covered War and Peace. And it's something I got from a book from the 2017 reading list called The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. And there's one chapter that was dedicated to describing the difference between happening truth and story truth. So in the fog of war, story truth, Tim O'Brien says story truth can actually get closer to the actual truth of what happened. Happening truth may be this happened, and then this general ordered this attack, and then this general responded with this attack, and there were this many casualties and this many wounded, and that is what happened. That's the happening truth. But the story truth may be a little more nuanced, and it might be how someone remembers the battle, but it may not be like if you were an actual visitor to that battle, the happening truth would be more of what happened, but the story truth may get more to the truth of what actually happened. And it's something I think about a lot, and it comes up in a lot of different books. But I think Tim O'Brien in the Things They Carried really nailed it in those two different kinds of ways of describing truth. And it's something that comes up a lot in Don Quixote. What is reality? What is truth? We see Don Quixote coming up upon numerous adventures. And so back to that windmill example. To Don Quixote, those windmills are giants. But to Sancho, they're windmills. And Cervantes does a great job of kind of balancing between the two characters. But there's always this tension throughout the book of what is reality in this sense? Is it what Don Quixote is saying, or is it what Sancho is saying, or is it what other people are saying? So it's just a really neat kind of way to think about the book. And one other thing I thought about is another book that I will highlight next year, where the author is talking to his son, and his son asks him, Dad, are there really dragons? And the dad kind of thought about that question. He's like, that is an awesome question. Dad, are there dragons? Because Dad going to work the next day is very unlikely to see a dragon at work. A fire-breathing dragon from a book. But there are dragons that we encounter every day of our life. And so, Dad, are there dragons? How would you answer that question? It's that tension that comes up over and over in this book, in that idea of story versus happening truth. Now on to segment 3 and the one thing. I always feel a little weird doing like a one key takeaway from a novel, especially an 1170 page novel. But I guess what I try to do for the one thing with an epic novel is, what is the key thing that stuck out to me in the book? What's the thing that still has me thinking a few days after reading it? And it's this, and this is really where I get into the main spoiler of this episode. So if you don't want to know how the story ends, please pause it. Don Quixote at the end of the novel recants his beliefs. He says knight errantry is not the way to go. It's not real. And he says that on his deathbed. And it was really disappointing. I guess part of me was, maybe wanting him to realize how absurd he had been and how he was a madman and everyone considered him a madman, and he should just maybe go home and try to find a wife and not have this ideal woman in his mind that he never actually meets, but get into the world of the real and not just the ideal. And yet he's such a likable character. He's such a likable guy that there's just this sense of disappointment at the end. At least I just kind of wanted him to stay consistent, but he doesn't. And it was good on some parts, but it was really disappointing on other parts. And so I'm still kind of thinking through the ending of the book. And that's my one key takeaway. That's the one thing that I'm continuing to think about after having read this book. So to recap, this was a hilarious book. I literally laughed out loud many, many times, and I just very rarely do that. It was very long. It was my longest book of the year. I wouldn't necessarily say it was worth it in the same way that Les Miserables or War and Peace were worth it, but it was very enjoyable and was very entertaining. I read the unabridged version, the full version. There's probably some good abridged versions out there where you could maybe get into 300 or 400 pages instead of 1,100. So you have different options there if you do want to read the book. But it just a lot to think about. Some really profound and hilarious things in this book. So that's going to do it for this episode. Before I sign off, just a reminder that you can now share your reading list on the Books of Titans website by going to booksoftitans.com/mybooks. You can also follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter @Books of Titans. And if you haven't already done so, you can subscribe to this podcast and find all of our past episodes through iTunes, the Android Marketplace, or your podcast manager of choice. If you're enjoying the podcast, please make sure to give us an effusive 5-star rating on iTunes and share your favorite episodes on social media. We'll be back next week with another book. Either Jason or I will be covering another one. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.